If this is how you treat the people who built this place, then you don't deserve to own it." Shaquille O'Neal didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table or point at anyone across the dining room. Somehow, that made the sentence even heavier. The words settled over the restaurant, like the first crack of thunder before a storm, and within seconds, every conversation disappeared. A waitress froze with 2 glasses of sweet tea balanced on her tray. The cooks behind the open kitchen stopped moving. Even the country music drifting through the speakers suddenly felt too loud. Restaurant manager Derek Collins looked at the giant man in the faded gray hoodie and laughed. To him, the stranger looked more like someone who had just finished unloading a truck than a businessman capable of changing anyone's future. "You don't deserve to own it," Derek said with a smirk. "Buddy, you couldn't afford the silverware in this place." A few uneasy laughs spread through the dining room, but Shaq never reacted. He calmly reached into his pocket, made one short phone call, and quietly said, "I've seen enough. Cancel the $38 million acquisition, effective immediately." Derek rolled his eyes, convinced he had just heard the world's worst bluff. Then his own phone rang. The caller ID showed only one name: Graham Whitmore, the owner of the entire Southern Hearth Restaurant Group. Derek answered confidently, but within seconds, the color drained from his face. Every employee watched his expression collapse as he whispered, "No? Sir? Please, let me explain." In less than a minute, the confidence that had filled the room was replaced by complete silence. Nobody understood how a man wearing an old hoodie had just destroyed a multi-million-dollar investment. But the truth was, Shaquille O'Neal hadn't walked into that restaurant looking for a reason to cancel the deal. He had walked in hoping someone would give him a reason to sign it. To understand how one ordinary dinner became the most expensive mistake Derek Collins would ever make, we have to go back exactly 6 hours. 6 hours earlier, Shaquille O'Neal was sitting alone in a black SUV outside Southern Hearth Grill in Brookhaven, Georgia, watching the lunch crowd move through the front doors. The restaurant sat at the edge of a busy shopping plaza, surrounded by a pharmacy, a dry cleaner, and a hardware store that had been there since the 1980s. From the outside, Southern Hearth looked successful. The brick walls were clean, the parking lot was full, and a polished wooden sign promised slow-cooked comfort food and honest Southern hospitality. That promise was exactly what Shaq had come to test. For the past 3 months, a private investment group he advised had been negotiating to acquire Southern Hearth Dining Company, a regional chain with 9 locations across Georgia and Alabama. The asking price was $38 million. On paper, the company looked strong. Sales had increased by 7%, food costs were under control, and the owners claimed employee retention was improving. But Shaq had spent too many years in business to trust a clean spreadsheet without asking who had cleaned it. He knew numbers could hide fear, bad leadership, and people working themselves into the ground. A profitable restaurant could still be rotten where it mattered most. 2 weeks earlier, an unsigned letter had arrived at the investment office. It contained no dramatic accusations, only one sentence. "If Mr. O'Neal wants to know what he is really buying, tell him to visit Brookhaven on a Tuesday afternoon and watch how they treat the kitchen staff." Most investors would have sent an auditor. Shaq chose to go himself. He wore a faded gray hoodie, loose jeans, and old brown boots, not as a costume, but because those were the clothes he preferred when he did not want business people performing for him. At 7 feet 1 inch tall, he knew disappearing completely was impossible, but people saw what they expected to see. In Atlanta, a man his size might be a former athlete, a security guard, or simply someone who wanted lunch. He hoped the employees would recognize him. He also hoped they would forget he was famous after a few minutes. Shaq had learned that people revealed more when they felt comfortable than when they felt inspected. He planned to order food, talk to the servers, listen to the rhythm of the kitchen, and leave without making a scene. If the restaurant treated its workers well, he would recommend completing the acquisition by the end of the week. If the letter was exaggerated, no one would ever know he had come. At 12:18 p.m., he stepped out of the SUV and crossed the parking lot alone. Through the front windows, he could see servers moving quickly between crowded tables, while a manager in a dark suit stood near the host station, watching them without helping. As Shaq reached for the door, an older cook appeared briefly behind the kitchen window. The man carried a heavy stock pot with both hands, while a younger employee shouted something at him from across the line. The cook lowered his head and kept walking. Shaq paused with his hand on the door. He had been outside for less than a minute, and already the unsigned letter felt less like a warning and more like an invitation to look closer. The moment Shaq stepped inside, the smell hit him first. Hickory smoke, fresh biscuits, roasted chicken, and black pepper floated through the dining room exactly the way a Southern restaurant should smell. Customers were lined up near the entrance. Servers moved quickly between crowded tables, and plates left the kitchen almost as fast as they came in. At first glance, Southern Hearth Grill looked like a business that had everything figured out. But Shaq had learned years ago that the real story of a restaurant was never told in the dining room. It lived behind the swinging kitchen doors, where nobody was pretending for the customers. A cheerful waitress with a bright smile walked over, carrying a pot of fresh coffee. Her name tag read Emily Carter, and although she welcomed every table with the same warm energy, Shaq noticed something unusual. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted toward the kitchen, as if she were checking on someone. When she came to his table, she smiled politely. "First time here?" she asked. Shaq nodded. "Then you picked a good day," she replied. "The fried chicken's the best thing on the menu." She sounded convincing, but there was a tiredness behind her smile that didn't match her words. As Emily walked away, an older man pushed through the kitchen doors, carrying a heavy stock pot large enough to feed 50 people. His movements were slow but practiced, every step careful, every motion efficient. His white chef's coat had been washed so many times that the fabric had turned almost gray. His name was Marcus Hale, 63 years old, and he had worked in professional kitchens longer than some of the servers had been alive. He never asked anyone to carry his weight, never complained when shifts ran long, and somehow still remembered the favorite meals of customers who came only once a month. The younger cooks respected him. The regular customers adored him. Yet nobody in the restaurant seemed to notice him except when something went wrong. Marcus barely had time to set the stock pot down before Derek Collins appeared beside him. "You're behind again." Derek snapped loudly enough for several employees to hear. Marcus glanced at the clock above the prep station. Lunch service had only begun 20 minutes earlier. "The chicken needs another 5 minutes," he answered calmly. "If I pull it now, it'll be dry." Derek didn't even look at the food. "I didn't ask for excuses," he said. "I asked you to move faster." Marcus lowered his eyes and quietly returned to work without saying another word. Shaq watched the exchange while pretending to study the menu. He had owned enough businesses to recognize the difference between accountability and humiliation. Derek wasn't trying to solve a problem. He was making sure everyone knew who had the power. The strange part was that nobody reacted. The line cooks kept chopping vegetables. The dishwashers continued spraying plates. Emily poured coffee for another table as if she had seen the same scene 100 times before. A few minutes later, a young accountant carrying a laptop hurried through the dining room and nearly collided with Derek. "Mr. Collins," he said nervously, "I still can't make the inventory numbers match yesterday's report." Derek's expression hardened instantly. "Then make them match," he replied without lowering his voice. "I don't care how you do it." The accountant, Nathan Brooks, hesitated for only a second before nodding and walking away. His shoulders slumped as though he already knew what Derek was really asking him to do. Emily returned with Shaq's sweet tea and noticed him watching the kitchen. "Marcus cooks almost everything you see coming out of there," she said quietly. "He's the reason people keep coming back." Before Shaq could respond, Derek shouted Marcus's name again from across the room. The entire kitchen fell silent for a heartbeat. Marcus wiped his hands on a towel, took a slow breath, and walked toward the office without asking why. Emily looked down at the table, then whispered so softly, only Shaq could hear, "Every time he gets called into that office, something bad happens." Shaq thanked her, but his attention never left the hallway where Marcus had disappeared. He had planned to spend an hour tasting food and reviewing customer service before making his recommendation to the investment group. Instead, less than 20 minutes after walking through the front door, he found himself wondering whether the unsigned letter had actually understated what was happening inside Southern Hearth Grill. And for the first time that afternoon, he stopped thinking like an investor and started paying attention like a witness. Marcus didn't return for almost 10 minutes. When he finally walked back into the kitchen, nothing about his face suggested what had happened inside Derek Collins's office. Yet everything about the room changed the moment he reappeared. Conversations stopped. A dishwasher glanced at him, then immediately looked away. Emily, who had just picked up another order, searched Marcus's face for an answer, but he simply forced a faint smile and returned to the grill as if the interruption had never happened. Shaq noticed something else. Marcus wasn't cooking the way he had been earlier. His movements were still precise, but they had become cautious, almost hesitant, as though every decision now carried consequences far beyond the food itself. Only a few minutes later, Derek walked through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who enjoyed reminding people who was in charge. "Inventory audit starts tomorrow morning," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I expect every number to match. If anything comes up missing, the person responsible won't be working here by lunchtime." The statement sounded routine to the customers in the dining room, but inside the kitchen, it landed like a threat. Nobody responded. Nobody asked questions. Derek looked around the room, apparently satisfied with the silence, before disappearing back toward the office. Shaq quietly sipped his tea while watching the reactions instead of the people speaking. Emily bit her lower lip before returning to the dining room. Nathan closed his laptop a little too quickly and rubbed his forehead. Even Olivia Bennett, the afternoon shift supervisor known for keeping the kitchen running smoothly, seemed unusually distracted. She checked the prep lists twice, then looked toward Marcus as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. Shaq had seen this kind of silence before. It wasn't respect. It was fear disguised as routine. A few minutes later, Nathan stepped outside through the rear delivery entrance carrying a stack of inventory sheets. Shaq excused himself, pretending to answer a phone call, and walked toward the parking lot just in time to hear raised voices behind the building. Derek stood with his back to the dumpsters, speaking in a calm tone that somehow sounded more threatening than shouting. "Those numbers don't leave this restaurant unless they match the report I approved," he said. Nathan hesitated. "But they don't match," he answered quietly. "We're missing nearly $4,000 in inventory." Derek folded his arms. "Then fix it." Nathan swallowed hard. That would mean changing the records. Derek took one step closer. "No," he replied coldly. "That means correcting them. If corporate sees shortages before the acquisition closes, every one of us has a problem. Do you understand?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded once, though the look on his face suggested he hated himself for doing it. Shaq remained hidden behind a delivery truck until both men walked away. $4,000 wasn't enough to destroy a company worth $38 million, but it was more than enough to destroy one employee if someone needed a scapegoat. The anonymous letter suddenly made a lot more sense. This wasn't about missing food. It was about creating a story that justified an audit. Back inside, Emily quietly placed another basket of biscuits on Shaq's table. "Everything okay?" she asked, with the same polite smile she gave every customer. Shaq looked toward the kitchen before answering. "Does Marcus always get blamed when something goes wrong?" Emily froze for just a second. It was barely noticeable, but Shaq caught it. "Marcus has worked here longer than anyone," she said carefully. "Sometimes, people who stay the longest become the easiest people to blame." Before Shaq could ask another question, Derek's voice echoed across the dining room again. "Marcus," he shouted, "don't leave after your shift today. We need to talk." Marcus looked up from the grill, nodded once, and quietly returned to cooking. He didn't ask why. He already knew. Across the room, Olivia watched the exchange with growing unease. She knew the inventory numbers had been altered because she had seen the original report before it disappeared from the office printer. Nathan knew it too, and so did Emily, who had overheard enough conversations to understand exactly where this was heading. None of them wanted Marcus to become the fall guy for someone else's deception. But speaking up meant risking their own jobs, their mortgages, and their families. For the first time that afternoon, Shaq realized he wasn't looking at a restaurant with one bad manager. He was looking at a workplace where decent people had slowly been taught that staying silent was the safest way to survive. And that was far more dangerous than one dishonest inventory report. The afternoon rush reached its peak just after 1 o'clock, and for nearly 30 minutes, the dining room buzzed with laughter, clinking silverware, and orders flying out of the kitchen. To every customer inside Southern Hearth Grill, it looked like another successful lunch service. Only the employees knew the atmosphere had changed. Marcus barely spoke unless someone asked him a direct question. Nathan avoided eye contact with everyone. Emily forced herself to smile at every table even though her thoughts kept drifting toward the office at the end of the hallway. Shaq remained quietly in his booth, eating slowly, listening far more than he talked. Years of business had taught him something valuable. People rarely revealed the truth during an argument. They revealed it in the quiet moments afterward. Halfway through his meal, a plate of mashed potatoes came back from a customer who claimed it was too cold. Marcus apologized immediately and prepared another serving without complaint, but Derek seized the opportunity. Holding the plate high enough for everyone to see, he announced that standards were slipping because certain people had gotten too comfortable. Marcus knew exactly what Derek was doing. The potatoes weren't the issue. Derek wanted everyone to associate every mistake with one name. A few minutes later, Olivia quietly admitted she had seen the original inventory report and knew Marcus wasn't responsible for the missing supplies, but she also confessed she was terrified of speaking up. Nathan felt the same way. Derek had already made it clear that anyone who challenged the official numbers would be risking far more than a disagreement with management. Shaq's attention sharpened when Nathan was called into the office carrying a folder of inventory reports. Through the partially open door, he caught enough of the conversation to understand exactly what was happening. Nathan insisted the numbers were wrong and refused to submit altered records. Derek calmly replied that keeping his job mattered more than keeping the paperwork honest. Minutes later, Nathan walked back into the kitchen looking defeated, whispering a quiet apology as he passed Marcus. Then Derek emerged carrying a sealed manila envelope and placed it directly on Marcus's workstation. "Don't leave after your shift," he said coldly. "We'll talk then." Nobody needed to ask what was inside. Emily lowered her head. Olivia stared silently at the floor. Marcus slid the envelope into a drawer without opening it and returned to cooking as if nothing had happened, watching the older man prepare meals with steady hands. Despite knowing his career was about to be sacrificed, Shaq quietly reached a decision of his own. He had entered Southern Hearth, intending to observe without interfering. But if an innocent man was about to become the price of a $38 million business deal, staying silent was no longer an option. The restaurant clock read 2:07 p.m. when the front doors opened again. At first, nobody paid much attention. A man in a navy suit stepped inside, followed by a woman carrying a leather portfolio and two executives wearing visitor badges around their necks. They weren't customers. They scanned the dining room as if they were looking for someone specific. Derek noticed them immediately and hurried toward the entrance, straightening his tie as he walked. A wide smile spread across his face. "Welcome to Southern Hearth," he said confidently, extending his hand. "I'm Derek Collins, the general manager. We weren't expecting corporate until tomorrow." The man in the navy suit barely acknowledged him. Instead, his eyes moved past Derek and settled on the giant customer sitting quietly in the corner booth, finishing the last sip of his iced tea. Relief crossed his face. "There you are," he said, as he walked straight across the dining room. "Mr. O'Neal, we've been trying to reach you for the last 15 minutes. Everyone is waiting for your decision." For a moment, nobody moved. Emily stopped carrying plates. Nathan slowly looked up from the register. Olivia froze beside the kitchen doors. Even Marcus turned away from the grill. Derek remained standing near the entrance, confused by what he had just heard. The executive reached Shaq's table and extended his hand. "I'm sorry we're late," he said. The board is ready whenever you are. Mr. Whitmore is on his way because he believes we'll be signing the acquisition agreement today." Shaq stood, towering over everyone in the room, and calmly shook the man's hand. "There won't be any signing," he replied. "I've already made my decision." Derek felt his stomach tighten. The stranger in the faded hoodie wasn't pretending. He wasn't bluffing. He was the investor everyone had been preparing for. The man whose recommendation would determine whether the $38 million acquisition moved forward. Suddenly, every sarcastic comment Derek had made over the last 2 hours replayed in his head. Just then, the front doors opened once more. Graham Whitmore, founder and owner of Southern Hearth Dining Company, hurried inside, looking more nervous than anyone had ever seen him. He walked directly toward Shaq, ignoring Derek completely. "Shaq," he said, slightly out of breath, "if there's been some misunderstanding, I'd appreciate the chance to fix it before you make this official." Shaq looked around the restaurant instead of answering immediately. His eyes rested on Emily, who still looked stunned. Then on Nathan, who held the inventory folder like it was evidence in a courtroom. Finally, they settled on Marcus, who had quietly returned to the grill because customers were still waiting for their meals. "There isn't a misunderstanding," Shaq said, calmly. "I've spent the last 2 hours watching how this restaurant treats the people responsible for its success. The food is excellent. The customers are happy. But the leadership—" He paused long enough for every employee to hear the next sentence. "Is failing the people who built this place." Derek finally found his voice. "Mr. O'Neal, with all due respect, you've only seen a small part of today's operations." Shaq turned toward him without raising his voice. "You're right," he answered. "I only saw one afternoon. But in one afternoon I watched you humiliate your most experienced cook, pressure your accountant to alter financial records, threaten employees into silence, and prepare to blame one honest man for mistakes he didn't make." The dining room became so quiet that the sound of the kitchen exhaust fans seemed deafening. Graham Whitmore slowly turned toward Derek. "Tell me he's wrong," he said. Derek opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Nathan stepped forward holding the inventory folder. Emily followed him. Then Olivia quietly walked out from the kitchen. For the first time all day, they weren't looking at Derek for permission. They were looking at each other. And Shaq realized the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. The truth no longer needed an investor to speak for it. It was about to come from the people who had been forced to live with it every single day. Nathan was the first to move. His hands were shaking so badly that several papers slipped from the inventory folder before he reached Graham Whitmore. Instead of picking them up immediately, he took a deep breath and said something nobody expected to hear. "Mr. Whitmore, these aren't the original inventory reports. Derek ordered me to change the numbers 3 different times this month." The room fell silent again. Nathan bent down, gathered the pages, and handed over another set from the bottom of the folder. "These are the originals. I kept copies because I knew someday someone would ask what really happened." Graham flipped through the reports, comparing signatures, dates, and handwritten corrections. The differences were impossible to ignore. Before Derek could interrupt, Emily stepped forward and quietly placed a small notebook on the table. She had spent months writing down incidents after every shift, employees sent home without explanation, food deliveries blamed on the wrong people, and conversations she happened to overhear while serving nearby tables. "I didn't write this because I wanted anyone fired," she said, her voice trembling. "I wrote it because I was afraid nobody would believe us when this day finally came." Olivia was the last person anyone expected to speak. She had spent years avoiding conflict, believing that keeping her head down was the only way to protect her family. But watching Marcus silently stand at the grill while everyone else fought for the truth finally became too much. "The inventory shortages never started with Marcus," she said, looking directly at Graham. "Several deliveries were approved without being checked, and when the numbers stopped matching, Derek told us the easiest solution was to blame the employee closest to retirement. He said corporate would never question replacing an older cook if the paperwork supported it." Derek immediately tried to deny everything. He insisted the employees were conspiring because they feared changes after the acquisition. But every sentence he spoke only made the evidence in Graham's hands more convincing. Nathan had the reports. Emily had dates and conversations. Olivia had witnessed the decisions. Together, their stories fit perfectly. For several long seconds, Graham Whitmore said nothing. He simply closed the folder and looked across the kitchen toward Marcus, who had remained exactly where he had been all afternoon. Even now, with his own future hanging in the balance, Marcus was carefully plating another order because customers were still waiting to eat. Graham slowly walked over to him. "Marcus," he said quietly, "is any of this true?" Marcus looked down at the plate in his hands before answering. "Most of it," he replied. "I didn't say anything because I thought protecting the restaurant mattered more than protecting myself. I kept believing things would get better." Graham closed his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of those words settling heavily on him. When he turned back toward Derek, the disappointment on his face hurt far more than anger ever could. "Derek Collins," Graham said calmly, "you're terminated, effective immediately." Nobody cheered. Nobody smiled. Derek stood frozen, staring at the people he had spent months intimidating. For the first time, he realized none of them looked afraid anymore. Security from the shopping center was called to escort him out, while Graham personally apologized to every employee standing in the kitchen. As Derek reached the front door, he stopped and looked back one final time. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "I thought protecting the deal was protecting the company," he admitted. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot the company was its people." Shaquille O'Neal nodded once, but said nothing. Derek's punishment wasn't losing a $38 million investment. It was realizing that his ambition had cost him the respect of every person who had worked beside him. And for a man who had spent years chasing power, that was the loss that would stay with him the longest. 6 months later, the parking lot outside Southern Hearth Grill looked completely different. Cars filled every space before noon, customers regularly waited outside for a table. And local newspapers had begun calling it one of the best family restaurants in the Atlanta area. The biggest surprise wasn't the increase in business. It was what had changed behind the kitchen doors. Marcus Hale no longer stood alone over the grill. His white chef's coat had been replaced with one embroidered with the words, "Kitchen Mentor," and every new cook hired by the restaurant spent their first 2 weeks working beside him. Emily had been promoted to dining room manager, where her kindness shaped the culture she had once been afraid to defend. Nathan became regional finance supervisor after helping redesign the company's reporting system, making sure no manager could ever manipulate inventory records again. Olivia accepted a leadership role as operations manager, determined to prove that good leadership wasn't about fear. It was about earning trust every single day. Shaquille O'Neal never bought the entire Southern Hearth chain. Instead, he invested only in the Brookhaven location, insisting it become the model for what the company could be if people mattered more than profits. He also funded a culinary scholarship in Marcus's name for young cooks who couldn't afford professional training, quietly asking that his own name appear nowhere on the program. Most customers never knew who had saved the restaurant. They simply noticed the warmer smiles, the better atmosphere, and the feeling that everyone working there genuinely wanted to be there. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, almost exactly 6 months after his first visit, Shaq returned wearing another old hoodie and the same worn boots. He ordered the fried chicken, sat in the same corner booth, and watched Marcus laughing with two young apprentices as they prepared lunch together. Nobody recognized him this time, and that was exactly how he wanted it. After finishing his meal, he left a generous tip beneath the receipt, nodded once toward the busy kitchen, and walked back into the Georgia sunshine without saying goodbye. Sometimes the greatest investment isn't measured in dollars or buildings. Sometimes it's measured by the lives that continue to grow long after you've quietly walked away.